be on YouTube now. Wasn't going to be.
Right, good evening. If you do have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please. Thank you. Right, a huge welcome for the final guest before the summer recess, Brian Halliwell, with Fact or Fiction, Golden Nuggets of History. Brian steps back in time and revisits our past, examining some popular historical facts in detail and how some are not as we first thought. Plus he sheds light onto dark myth and mystery in a unique and well-researched style. Please welcome Brian Halliwell.
Thank you very much, Rob. And can I just please check that everything is sound and clear at the back? Everything okay? Yes. Clear? Because mics can be a bit funny. But thank you again, Rob, and it's a pleasure to come along again and do this talk, which I've given the title of Fact or Fiction, for want of a better title, really. And this, in some ways, just carries on from the talk I did last year, which was called Historical Tales, Myths and Stories. And what we found by discussing that talk last time, that some of the things that we believed to be true, when we looked at them a bit closer, we found that the opposite was true. And that's what we talked about last time. And this is going to be a bit of a follow-on about just some general stuff that we can talk about over tonight. Just a simple talk, really, to round off the season before it carries on later on in the year. And just to give you a reminder of what we did talk about last time, we also mentioned in the last talk about Devil's Island, the notorious prison that's off the coast of South America, just off the northeast coast. And most of us have heard about Devil's Island, the prison, the notorious, sadistic, brutal prison. And we found out last time when we discussed it that it wasn't brutal and savage and all the rest of it, because we've seen it in the films with people like Steve McQueen in Papillon, and we see these images of a brutal prison. But when we studied it a bit closer, we found out that the opposite was true. It was nothing like in the films or in the books. And that was just one of them. We also talked last time about the Pony Express, the famous galloping service that started in 1860 in America, and everybody's familiar with the Pony Express in the Wild West, with the riders going across the American plain delivering the mail sacks. And we found out as we studied that, because it's famous in books and in films, we found out as we got into the Pony Express that one of the pioneer riders was a bloke from Preston down the road, Tom Dobson, who also rode with Buffalo Bill. And Thomas Dobson, who nobody's ever heard of, was from Preston, and his route to the Wild West started 20 years before 1860 and 1840, when Brigham Young, the Mormon leader at the time, came over to Preston looking for new converts, and the Dobsons and one or two others were converted, so they then moved over to America, and that's how he got involved, Thomas Dobson from Preston, in the Pony Express. And we also found out when we discussed it that this Pony Express service, very, very famous, seating all the westerns and countless programmes, but it only lasted 18 months. People think it lasted years, and it lasted 18 months, because once the telegraph service came in 1861, it basically finished all the express riders, and they were basically redundant. Because the telegraph service came in, no need for Pony Express riders. So we also discovered that. And we also talked about, just for a few minutes, I'll remind you, we talked about Judge Jeffreys. Nobody had ever heard of him, but he was the hanging judge during Charles II's reign. The hanging judge. And everybody lived in fear of Judge Jeffreys. And he was hated and feared throughout the land. But we also found out last time that everybody didn't hate Judge Jeffreys, because in Preston, where I live, in Preston, they loved him. They loved Judge Jeffreys, and the reason why they loved Judge Jeffreys, even though he was the hanging judge, because he once did a great favour for Preston. In 1684, when Preston needed a trading charter, it was Judge Jeffreys who helped to get it, because he had influence with Charles II, and also Judge Jeffreys, which is not commonly known, his mother was from Lancashire. So he had a soft spot for Preston. So when he got that trading charter for Preston put on a grand banquet, a grand dinner for him, and then he wrote a letter to Preston to thank the Preston people for the dinner, and that letter is still in Preston archives, signed by Judge Jeffreys, the dreaded Judge Jeffreys. These were just little snippets I was talking about last time. And I also mentioned towards the end of the last talk, just talked about cockroaches. I just rounded it off talking about cockroaches, because cockroaches are the most loathed and hated insect in the world, but we found out that they are one of nature's true wonders. One of nature's true wonders, and they are one of the cleanest insects in the insect world. We found that out when we discussed it. Even though everybody hates them, we found out that they're one of the cleanest insects. And we also found out that they are one of nature's survivors because they've outlived the dinosaurs. Where the dinosaurs have been extinct for 65 million years, the cockroaches were around before then, and before they came on the planet, and they're still around to this day. So they're nature's great survivors. So that's roughly a few pointers that we talked about last time. And I'm going to start really tonight's talk, again, by talking about a few odd facts and figures, because I'm just going to start talking now on this particular talk, starting off with talking about the dead. Because the first thing that always strikes me, there's a lot of dead folk. Always strikes me there's a lot of dead people. And when people put forward this wacky idea that there are more people living now than there's ever lived in the past, is wrong. That is a myth. And I've heard it said many times that people say that. That's a myth, by at least a factor of 13. At least a factor of 13. Because when you think about the Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens sapiens, as some people call them, who have lived, fought, loved, potted about, and eventually died over the last 100,000 years, it numbers about 90 billion. About 90 billion have lived over the last 100,000 years. And that is a big number. But it's also a small number. Because if you put all these bodies that's lived over the last 100,000 years side by side in a big plot, you could get them all in a plot the size of England and Scotland put together. And that's only about 0.1% of the landmass of the Earth. So it's not that big. And if you wanted to weigh all these bodies that's lived and died over the last 100,000 years, if you wanted to weigh them on a big scales, if you could make a big scales, they would weigh a lot less than the ants, who are still around to this day and still out there now plotting God knows what. It's only a matter of perspectives, because the dead are our family. The dead are our family. And I don't just mean our direct relations like our mum and dad, the 2 parents, the 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. I mean, I'm just talking about in general. You only have to go back 10 generations to find out that we have each about 1,000 relatives. 10 generations. And if you go back 15 generations, that number swells to about 35,000. And you only need to go back to the year 1250 to find out that we've got more direct ancestors than the number of people who've ever lived. And if you're thinking, what? How does that work? The solution to that paradox, apparently, is because we're all interrelated. And the further back in time you go, you find out that we've got more ancestors that we can share. We're sharing ancestry with most of the others. And the common ancestor of everybody living in Europe only lived about 600 years ago. And everybody alive on the planet today, is directly related to people in the ancient past, even people like Confucius, a Chinese philosopher of about 479 BC. We are directly related to him. And even people like Queen Nefertiti in ancient Egypt were directly related to them in some fashion from about 1330 BC when she died. So in other words, these are just a few oddball facts and figures about the dead people and us that in some way we are related. Just a few oddball facts and figures. And just mentioning Queen Nefertiti there in ancient Egypt, I'm going to stick with the ancient world just for a few minutes, because I just want to talk about now one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time was done on the 6th of December 1876. 6th of December 1876, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries. And it was discovered by a German, Henrik Schliemann, who uncovered one of 5 treasure-filled tombs, and now known as Grave Circle A. And there was 19 bodies surrounded by gold and jewels. There was bronze weapons inlaid with gold and silver. There was gold and silver breastplates, gold and silver cups. It was a fabulous treasure trove find in 1876. The greatest find was in Grave 5. That was the greatest find in Grave 5, because Henrik Schliemann uncovered a golden mask, which he believed to be the death mask of Agamemnon. Wow, the king of Mycenae. So he telegraphed the Greek king, Henrik Schliemann telegraphed the Greek king and said, I have just looked into the face of Agamemnon. Wow. In that excavation where Schliemann was digging, he uncovered an aristocracy that was very, very wealthy. He discovered a rich aristocracy, and it was a great Mycenaean civilization from long ago in this village that he uncovered. a Mycenaean civilization that was alive and part of a big civilization that existed for about 500 years, that dated from about 1600 to about 1100 BC, which replaced the Minoan culture of Crete. And this city that he uncovered in 1876 is the oldest city, this Mycenaean city, oldest on the Greek mainland. There's only Knossos in Crete older, and I have toured the Knossos site in Crete, and that's the only one that's older. Anyhow, the point being, they dated all these finds from 1876 that Schliemann uncovered, including the death mask, which he believed to be Agamemnon. They dated it and found that the date of all these finds was about 1600 BC. So it couldn't have been the death mask of Agamemnon, because Agamemnon was part of one of the greatest stories ever told, which supposedly took place 400 years after the bodies in the tombs had been laid to rest. So it wasn't the death mask of Agamemnon. So I want to talk about this story that Agamemnon was involved in 400 years after these bodies had been placed. So that proved that it wasn't the death mask of Agamemnon. And the story I'm talking about is the Trojan Wars. One of the greatest stories ever told, and one of the most popular stories around the world, is the Trojan Wars. We've all heard of the Trojan Wars, surely, have we? And that came down to us from Homer, who lived in the 8th century BC in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, and he was a Greek scholar, he was a Greek speaker and a Greek storyteller, and he wrote a book called the Iliad, which tells us all about the Trojan War. And in that book, Homer tells us that that battle and that war took place about 300 years before his time, so that dates it to 1200 BC. It dates it to 1200 BC. And in other words, the Trojan War is a great war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And the leader of the Greek army, the Greeks and Trojans, the leader of the Greek army, King Agamemnon, who we've just talked about, King Agamemnon, leader of the Greek army, King Menelaus of Sparta, and the Greek warriors, Achilles and Odysseus, and then all the Greek army. On the Trojan side, King Priam, the king of Troy, King Priam, and the Trojan warriors, Hector and Paris. And just to refresh some people's minds, Paris, it's Paris's love affair with the King Menelaus of Sparta, his wife Helen, that sparks off this 10-year war. Because what Paris does when he's over in Greece, he has this love affair with Helen, he kidnaps her and takes her back to Troy. And this is what triggers the 10-year war, because the Greeks want her back, which they will do. So King Agamemnon and King Menelaus, they gather up the Greek army to try to get Helen back from Troy. So they laid siege to Troy for 10 years. The outcome of this battle is that the Greeks win. The Greeks defeat the Trojans because they trick the Trojans. As we all know from school, they trick the Trojans because after 10 years of stalemate, one morning the Trojans get up and they find outside the city gates a gigantic wooden horse. No sign of the Greek army, because they've sailed off, but they've only gone round the corner, out of the way. So the Trojans don't think of anything suspicious, so they look on it as a gift or a peace offering. So they open the gates of Troy and wheel in this massive, big, giant wooden horse, then close the gates. During the night, when the Trojans are asleep, a trapdoor unlocks from the wooden horse and all the Greek soldiers pile out. They go and open the gates of Troy. In the meantime, the Greek armies now sail back. The Greek army storms up the beach through the gates of Troy. They ransack the city and massacre all the Trojans, including Paris, who's had the love affair with Helen. So the end of this story is that Helen is reunited with her husband, King Menelaus of Sparta. So in other words, the Greeks win the Trojan War. And the other book that Homer wrote to go with it was the Odyssey. And the Odyssey was all about Odysseus, the Greek warrior, and his adventures and his journey back to Greece after the Trojan Wars had finished. These two books in ancient Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey, came together in one book, and that became the Greek Bible. And that was the book that all the Greeks used to read to find out the values of life and to understand all about Greece's golden past. For the ancient civilizations, there was no doubt that these people and the Trojan Wars took place. That was their history. There was no doubting that these figures and these wars took place. Of course they did. It was their history. They believed it fully. Even the Romans laid great importance to the Trojan Wars because they said they were founded from the Trojan warriors. Because if you read Virgil's classic first century book, the Aeneid, which is all about Aeneas, who is a Trojan warrior who flees the ruins of Troy and starts a life in Italy, and he is the founder of what became Rome and the Roman Empire. So in other words, Aeneas the Trojan warrior and his descendants, Romulus and Remus, if you can remember it from school, they found the city of Rome and then the great Roman Empire. So Aeneas is the one and the originator of all this great culture, the Trojan warrior. So it was very important for the Romans as well. But over the centuries, as the centuries passed, all these stories and the wars vanished into the mists of time. And Troy in northwest Turkey is looked on as a mystic place, and all these stories and battles and all these Greek heroes dropped into the realm of fairy tales. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is all this just Greek mythology, or did it actually happen? For Henrik Schliemann, who uncovered the Mycenaean tombs in 1876, he believed that the stories were true. He believed that Homer's stories and poems wasn't just stories. He believed at the heart of these stories was the true story and battles that actually took place. Henrik Schliemann, who uncovered the Mycenaean tombs in 1876, decided he wanted to find out. He decided he wanted to prove that the Trojan War existed, and he wanted to find evidence. So 5 years before he uncovered the Mycenaean tombs, he went in search on his Trojan quest. To just talk about Henrik Schliemann for a few minutes, he was a remarkable fella, a German he was, and he was a brilliant man, because he was born in 1822, and he was one of 5 children born to a drunken wife-beating pastor, so he had a dodgy beginning, but he was determined to get a good education and learn a lot because he wanted to succeed in business. He taught himself 12 languages. Now that is a massive undertaking. To learn one language would be brilliant. He'd learnt and taught himself 12 languages. By the age of 36, because he had phenomenal energy, by the age of 36, he was rich. He'd made a fortune. And he decided at 44 to fulfill his childhood dream, to study the classical world. So when he was 46, he ditched his wife and 3 children and got himself a new wife, Sophia, a Greek beauty. She was not only a Greek beauty, she was also a classical scholar. So Henrik Schliemann, in 1871, with his new Greek wife, went in search of the Trojan Wars and Troy. So he went over to Turkey, and the site of Troy is in the northwest corner of Turkey, right on the Aegean coast, and he found out when he went to Turkey that the probable site of ancient Troy and the Trojan Wars was at a place called Hisarlik. And at Hisarlik is a massive big hill, a big mound, and everybody said the ruins of Troy and the Trojan War site is right at the bottom of that mound. So in 1871, Heinrich Schliemann decided to go and dig for the Trojan Wars. He was very rich, him and his wife, so he hired all these diggers. He got a big army of diggers, and he set to digging to try to find the Trojan Wars. He had fearsome energy, single-minded determination, and he was determined to find it. And with his armies of diggers against all the odds, flies, the heat, snakes and scorpions, malaria, all the pitfalls digging in this mound, plus his own massive problem of chronic constipation, which he kept at bay by drinking English pale ale. That will keep anybody regular. So, but despite all this, he had problems, but you can just see him and picture him on this Trojan site with his wife digging for what he could find. Over 2 years, he found nothing. All he found were bits of pottery and bits of things that turned up. No wealth, but in 3 years, 1873, he discovered a big ancient palace. He discovered the fortifications of a massive fort and palace, which he took to be King Priam's palace in Troy, and fabulous treasures. So in 1873, Henrik Schliemann announced to the world he had found the ancient Troy and the Trojan War site. It was one of archaeology's greatest finds, and it captivated the minds of the Western world. It captivated the minds of the Western world. But breaking his promise not to remove any of the treasure from the site, he smuggled it all out of Turkey and smuggled it over to Athens. And in Athens, he outlaid all this treasure, necklaces, rich diadems and necklaces and jewels, which he festooned around his wife Sophia's neck for pictures so that she could pose like Helen of Troy. It was his greatest moment. This is 5 years before the Mycenaean tomb excavation. So it was a massive moment for Henrik Schliemann, and he expected worldwide acclaim, but he didn't get it.